brother Tim Lewis. Tim is the pulpit minister for the North MacArthur Church of Christ in Oklahoma City and has been such for since 2004. So he's gotten quite a tenure there, and that is where my wife and I met Tim. I began working full-time with the Bear Valley Bible Institute in their International Schools program in 2009, and those first 3 years we moved to Oklahoma City. And we moved there with the idea that, we weren't sure where we were going to worship. Our daughter Jessica was already worshiping at North MacArthur. We visited there first, but I knew of about 3 other congregations that I thought would be good and knew the people there, and we'd visit around and decide. Well, we never did visit around. We stopped at North MacArthur, and that became home. And over those 3 years that we were there before moving back to Denver, I developed a great appreciation for our brother Tim. He is one of the most well-read preachers that I know in the brotherhood, and stays on top of things, does a great job in his presentation, and we really love and appreciate him. Tim is a graduate of Oklahoma Christian with a bachelor's degree in English education. As the resident grammar Nazi here at Bear Valley, I have a great appreciation for people with English degrees. He also has a master's degree in ministry from there. And he and his wife, Tawny, have 3 children. They have 2 daughters, Macy and Callie, and 1 son, Ryder, all of whom have gotten a lot older in the last 10 years since we've been away from there. But we really do have a great love for Tim, for Tawny, for their family, and the work that they're doing. And so, Tim, come preach the word.
I want to start with a story. You won't know the names of the people, but you'll be able to relate to experiences in your own life, in your own ministry, in your own local church family. That fellow's name was Bill Klusman. When I started preaching with the congregation in Mount Vernon, they had a little veterans home there. And this fellow was in the veterans home. His wife would come sit with him every day, sit with him all day, pretty much every day. And when he was 91 years old, he was baptized in a whirlpool tub there at the veterans home. Didn't live much longer after that, after his baptism. When I went to the graveside for the service, it was cold. It was a winter day. It was raining. And yet I wasn't surprised that there was a good number of Christians that have gathered there. Here's the funny thing. Most of the people there that day had never met Bill. They didn't know him. They just knew his wife, Nova. She was a member of our congregation. And on the way home, I guess the funeral director gave her a ride back to her house, and he said this to her in that brief conversation. He said, "You folks sure do know how to take care of your own, don't you?" You know, I think that's been my experience. When my father was restored back in the early 80s and my mother was taught and baptized, I have 2 brothers, all 3 of us were converted. I think that in my experience of nearly 40 years with God's people, that we understand and we obey the commandment here in Romans 12:15, not just to rejoice with those who rejoice, but to weep with those who weep. You know, I believe that there are people outside. They don't know who we are. They think they know who we are, but they don't really know us. And they've reached some conclusions about Christianity, about Christians, that if they ever really understood what it was like to be a part of this family when you're facing crisis, I think it would change their minds. I think this lesson this morning, this command from Scripture to weep with those who weep, is something that would throw open the doors of God's kingdom to those who are on the outside. There's so many people who are hurting alone that they would love to be a part of a family that carries one another's burdens, that walks with each other through the difficult things that happen in life. I think this is something that draws people, and I think it's one of the reasons that people refused to leave. They would never give up what they found in Christ. They would never give up what they found in this family. I remember one time when I was working in Missouri, there was a young man there. He worked a lot with cattle and horses, and one time he was trying to rope a cow out of the back of a pickup truck, and must have hit a rock or something, and it threw him out of the truck. He had a bad head injury. And I just know that his mom and dad were at the hospital night and day. And that night, your phone rings at 2 o'clock in the morning, you know it's not going to be good news. And yet you get there, and there are elders there, there are other brothers and sisters. And throughout the weeks that followed, people came and sat with them and cried with them and prayed with them and brought them meals so that they could stay there with their son. And towards the end of that, was sitting there alone. It was Janice and Fido Arredondo. That was their names. And Janice started to cry, and she said, "I didn't know." You know what she was saying? She was saying that she didn't realize in all of her life in the church, until she went through such a terrible experience, she didn't realize what a blessing it was. She didn't know all the things that people like the ones who are you, people just like you, all that you do for people when they're hurting. And as she fought back tears, she said, never again will anything like this happen to somebody else, and for me to just sit on the sidelines. And so I think a lot of you already know all the lessons that I have in mind to share this morning, but for those who might not know, you may not have experienced the need for this blessing. What do we need to do? What are some of the basic requirements of weeping with those who weep? And we're going to spend most of our time on this first point. You have to be aware. You have to be aware. It's one of the remarkable things as we study the life of Christ, how aware he was of people around him and of their needs. He's always aware of hungry people who need food, or sick people who need healing, little children who need affection, who need affirmation, grieving people that need comfort, weary people who need rest, lost people who need to be found. We need to mimic that awareness. As Paul says, have this mind in you which is also in Christ Jesus. Well, part of the mindset of Jesus Christ is not only looking out for your own interests, but also the interests of others. You can't be a self-absorbed person, boxed in on every side by me, myself, and I, and be a person who weeps with those who weep. You've got to be aware. And I wonder if you realize the colossal heartache that's sitting around you, next to you, all over. Every Sunday when we assemble, somebody's hurting. There are people whose lives really are falling apart. They're devastated. A tragedy they never saw coming. They lost a parent, a spouse, a child. Earlier this year, and I remember going to the hospital just hours after this loss, a lady wakes up, I think it was like it was the morning of her 39th anniversary. She's waking up to a day that is supposed to be a day of rejoicing and celebration, and her husband is dying of a heart attack. And as we walk into the hospital waiting room to the news that he's gone, she's so overwhelmed by grief that they wheel her out. She can't even stand. She's in a wheelchair and so distraught and crying out, "I'm so angry. I'm so angry." Why? Because I couldn't save him. And I'm telling you, there are people like that who are going to be in worship with you on Sunday. You got to be aware. You've got to understand that there are those who are feeling that way as they assemble to sing and to pray. And the burden of grief is just crushing the joy out of their lives. I want you to think about the elderly people who are staying home and we still have some that are staying home because of the pandemic. Some who just, they are not physically able. I mean, they're truly shut in. There was a widow one time who came on a Sunday, and little old ladies get a hug from me. I think that's all right. And one of them said, I love it when you hug me, because there are times that I've gone a week or longer, and I've not been touched by another human being. And one lady who had lost her husband said, I like to be invited to do things with others, but the hardest part is to go home to an empty house. And sometimes I say no to the invitation because it's so hard. Not the going out, but the coming back to a place that is so quiet and so empty. There are young people that desperately want to know the joy of bringing a child into the world. And while they rejoice with others who have experienced that, they agonize over the fact that they're unable to have children, or they've suffered through one miscarriage after another. And those people are sitting on a Sunday morning as we announce the joy of another family that's welcomed a little boy, a little girl into their lives, and they rejoice with that news, but they're hurting. When will their time come? When will they experience the joy that they so long for? And we've got to be aware of that kind of pain. There could be somebody sitting next to us from week to week who is carrying the invisible scars of abuse. The hands of somebody who is supposed to love them. Somebody who was supposed to protect them. And that person violated that sacred trust. And they bear, again, those invisible scars. It's affected every other relationship that they have. The pain that they're carrying. Maybe some of them are suffering alone. They've never told anybody else what's happened to them. And those people sit next to us and they sing next to us and they pray with us. And we have to understand that in our spiritual family, there are those who are weeping. 2020, right after the pandemic, first time I ever had a kidney stone. All my friends who said this too shall pass, pray for those brothers, because that wasn't funny at the moment. That wasn't funny at all. It was about 7 weeks because there was the initial surgery. I was born with just one kidney. I don't know why. I was just born with one kidney, and they wanted to be very careful about that, so they decided to go ahead and get the stone. When I should have been healing from the surgery, I didn't heal, and I couldn't figure out why. They went back in, thought it was another stone. It was scar tissue, and so they had to basically do the same procedure over again. And I'm saying that to say this. Most of us don't know what it's like to live with chronic pain. Now, there are days that we wake up, and you remember one time when the preachers at our Affirming the Faith seminar talked about sleep injuries. You reach an age where you wake up and you feel crippled and you don't even know what happened to you, you know. But there are some people that cannot remember the last day without pain. That every day they wake up. And in fact, just recently there's a member of our congregation that said, you know, I'm dealing with chronic back pain. And I used to hear people talk about that, and I think, oh, your back hurts a little bit. She said, until it happened to me, I didn't realize how debilitating it could be. And there are people like that. There are people that come every week, and they're here, and they're hurting in ways that most of us haven't experienced. And we don't understand. Do you know how many people come in here every Sunday and they've missed the mark? And they've fallen short of the glory of God? We started a recovery program a couple years ago at North MacArthur, and there was a little elderly man that by the time he died, he was 36 years or more, clean and sober. And he'd come in one Sunday morning, he said, could we have a recovery program here at North MacArthur? And I said, well, what would it take? And he said, a room and a pot of coffee. And some of those guys have a coin that they carry around with a 24 on it. They're trying to go one day without drinking. One day. They're trying to make it 24 hours without taking drugs or looking at pornography. You know, folks that have been saved by the blood of Jesus, they have a history. They have some things that have become ingrained habits in their lives they're trying to break free of. And what they don't need is our condescending disappointment and our gossip. What they need is somebody who will try to understand the battle that they're facing. Sometimes it's physical, sometimes it's emotional, sometimes it's spiritual. You know, there are people, I think every Sunday, we don't realize that they're trying to save their marriage, that they're concerned about an adult son or daughter who's left Christ, and they don't know if their marriage is going to last. They don't know if that son or daughter's ever going to come home. And I'll be honest with you, I don't know if the pandemic exposed that or caused some of that. But it seems like there are a lot of families in crisis. And you know what people need? That they need somebody who is aware enough to understand what's going on in their lives and to weep with those who weep. I've spent most of my time on that point because I think it's really important. We can get so caught up in our own world and the things that are happening in our marriage, in our family, in our home, that we're not as aware as we should be. How can we weep with those who weep if we don't know that they're weeping? How can we carry one another's burdens if we don't even know about the burdens that they're carrying? We need to be aware. Well, along with being aware, and I think this is really important, we have to be present. We have to be present. A lot of us know the story of Job, and there's a lot of negative things about Job's friends, but there are some things that they did right. In fact, there's some things that we can look at their example, and we really ought to do what they did. And the first thing I want you to look at is chapter 2 and verse 11 of Job. And here's a man that lost his wealth and his health, and you know he's lost all of his possessions, his children, the moral support of his wife, cursed God and die. And Job 2:11. Job's three friends heard of all this evil that had come upon him, and they came each from his own place: Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, Zophar the Naamathite. They made an appointment together to come and show him sympathy and comfort him. And I think one of the most important things you can do when someone's hurting is show up. One of the most important things you can do is be present. There's something powerful about your presence. And Job's friends made an appointment to do three things. Number one is to come to him. Well, when you hear about some terrible diagnosis, some family trauma, some disappointing failure that somebody has experienced in their walk with God, one of the most important things you can do is make an appointment to show up. And they did that, to show him sympathy and to comfort him. I don't think it's impossible, but I think it's a lot more difficult to show sympathy or to offer comfort from a distance. Being present makes it easier for the one suffering to see the tears in your eyes, to hear the tremor in your voice, to feel the warmth of your embrace. You know, it's hard to show that from a distance. There are four boys here from North MacArthur. Two of them are brothers. And they haven't been here very long, a couple of months, but you know, their mom and dad came out here this week to see them. And just last night, I saw Dad come down the aisle and his son stepped over somebody else to get out. And if you could have seen that embrace. Now, you know, for weeks now, months, they've been sending their love from home. But that's not the same as what I saw last night when Dad wrapped his son up in his arms and he felt the warmth of his father's embrace. You can't send that from a distance. There's some things you can't communicate in a well-worded letter or email. I know that there are sincere people who have been hurt by God's church, and they have been hurt. I'm not one of those people. My experience in over 25 years of ministry has been a positive experience of God's people showing up. You know, when a little boy's riding his bike to school for the first day, it's the first day of school, it's the first time that his parents have allowed him to ride his bike, and he comes up over a hill, and a car is passing, coming the other way, and hits him. Well, where do you find the people of God? You find them in a waiting room sometime after midnight, holding hands and praying to God as a surgeon is very carefully, drilling a hole in that little boy's skull to relieve the pressure to save his life. And God's people are there. I've seen it. I can't tell you how much I love you. I can't even begin to express how impressed I've been when I go to a hospital waiting room, and even before I get there. And I'm not talking about preachers and elders. I'm talking about brothers and sisters. I'm talking about the family of God. You're sitting there, and you brought food, and you brought your friendship, and the comfort of your presence, and sometimes we're laughing together, and sometimes we're crying together, and sometimes we're praying together, but we're there. And you get the news that somebody's passed away. And people come to the home. I was 26 years old when I started in full-time ministry. Within 6 months, there's a there's a rude awakening when somebody dies and they call the preacher, and you realize, hey, that's me. That's me now. I'm 26. They're calling me. And I went to their house, and all day, members of the church are coming and hugging this lady's been a widow for an hour. And they're hugging her neck. And some of them just quietly came in, went to the kitchen, and brought food and put it in the fridge. And others, they didn't say much. They just came and hugged her neck and cried. It's a beautiful thing. Listen, your marriage is not exempt to some of the things that are going on in the world. You can be affected by that. And when bad things happen to Christian marriages, I've seen God's people show up. I remember one time, and a man came forward and he said, I've been unfaithful to God, I've been unfaithful to my wife, I've been unfaithful to my family. It was a heartbreaking confession, and we thought that was it. We thought they were going to make it. He admitted it, and he would change, but he didn't change. And she called and she said, I think he's still seeing this other woman. And I remember cars filled with men going to his house. And it wasn't a lynch mob. It wasn't hey, we're going to go get this guy. These were people that knocked on his door and stood on his front porch and cried because they cared about him, and they cared about his wife, and they cared about his kids. God's people show up at the cemetery. And you ladies are amazing. The things you do, the way that you're able to communicate care and compassion, it's a remarkable gift. We have these little meals that we provide after the funeral. We have the funeral, they go to the graveside, they come back, and all of their family, and they eat. And the ladies of the church have prepared this incredible meal. So many good things happen in that setting as people are able to come up and express their condolences and share memories and talk about things that happened. That one time she said this, or one time he did that. And that's healing. There's something beautiful that happens in that context. This next point, I'll just tell you, is a little bit hard. We must be quiet. We must be quiet. And it's something else that Job's friends got right. The Word of God says when they saw him from a distance, they didn't recognize him. Has that ever happened to you? You ever hear that somebody has cancer and they're on chemotherapy or radiation, and as they're going through that, you may not see him for weeks or months, and then you see him, and when you see him at first, you don't. I remember this happening one time. I knew this man. I knew him well, and when he came in to the office, I asked the secretary, who was that? And I was a little bit ashamed when he left because I knew him, and I didn't recognize him. Sometimes when people get sick, it changes their appearance. Job's friends didn't even recognize him. They raised their voices and they wept and they tore their robes and they sprinkled dust on their heads toward heaven, and they sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him. They saw that his suffering was very great. Job's friends became miserable comforters when they tried to explain his suffering. And I want to tell you, if you want to be a miserable comforter, then try to explain to people why they're hurting. If you want to be a great comforter, do what these guys did the first 7 days. In verse 13, no one spoke a word to him. In verse 12, they raised their voices and wept. Let me tell you what people do. In the effort to say just the right thing, they end up saying the wrong thing. My oldest brother, Jeff, is 6 years older than me. A few years ago, we got a phone call that he went to sleep one night and he didn't wake up. I want to tell you that I understand, and I understood it when it was happening, that the people who are saying these things to me love me. They care about me, and they're trying to help. But I want to tell you, some of the things they said didn't help. Telling me that my brother is now an angel, that didn't help me. I don't think that's accurate. I don't think there's anything about that that's true. Telling me or my mother and father, and I'm going to tell you something, one of the hardest things I've ever experienced was not the loss of my brother. It was watching my mother grieve the loss of my brother. That was hard. And when somebody says, God loved him so much that he wanted Jeff to be in heaven with him, that didn't comfort me. How do you say to somebody, God loved your husband so much that he took him away from you? How do you say to their kids, God loved your daddy so much that he had to have him in heaven? How do you say to a mother whose heart is breaking, your boy's a good boy, God loved him so much he took him away from you? I know that the people who said that meant well. I know that they loved me. But those words didn't help. Do you know, you don't get time off for this kind of stuff. I mean, you go to the funeral, but when you come back, you do what you do. You preach. And the thought of standing up in front of the whole church, days after burying my brother, and trying to maintain an emotional focus and concentration. And what am I going to say? And what do people expect from me today? And as I came in, this lady, I caught her out of the corner of my eye. She was coming to me, and she just had tears rolling down her cheeks, and she hugged me, and she said, I'm sorry. And that was it. She didn't try to explain anything. She didn't try to say bring any deep theological wisdom. That was one of the most comforting things. That was so eloquent. And I would suggest that the best you can do is, I'm so sorry for your loss, and I love you. And beyond that, I wouldn't say very much. Be helpful. We must be helpful. I think this is what made the Good Samaritan good, is he was helpful. It's part of why we know his story and love his story and tell his story. Because he could have walked by on the other side, but he decided to help. He went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine, and he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, take care of him. Whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back. And you learn several important lessons from the Lord's parable. Weeping with those who weep requires compassion. That's actually verse 33. It takes time. It takes money. You got to look for ways to be helpful. And some of these things is, after I wrote and submitted the chapter, you just think of all the ways you've seen, some people catch the church being bad. Do you know what I mean by that? And they seem to get a lot of joy out of catching God's people at their worst. And I like to catch God's people at their best. I love stories that highlight the goodness and the greatness of God's people. I have a very close friend. He's an elder at North MacArthur, and he and his wife, it's Mark and Patty Landis, and they lost their son Zach to cancer. That was a hard season of life for them. I've heard him talk about it. And he talked about taking their son to the Children's Hospital, OU Children's Hospital in Oklahoma City, and deciding, you know what, we're going to go to Duke Medical, Center. And so they uproot their family and they go to North Carolina, and that first Sunday they're in a hotel. And they said, we got to find a church. We've got to find a Church of Christ where we can attend on Sunday. Their first Sunday. They're half a country away from home. They don't know anybody. They come into this congregation and people meet them and learn their story. And Mark said, one of the elders of that church said, you're coming to our house. You're moving out of that hotel and you are moving into our house. And no. He said, listen, if you don't come, we're bringing our car and we're getting you. Now think about this. Total strangers to that area, to that city, to that church. And Mark said they handed us the keys to their house and they left for a week to go on vacation. And they let a family of strangers. Who does that? You people do that. I'm preaching to people who do things like that. You're God's people. And you know how to be helpful. You know how to meet needs in practical ways. It's part of your spiritual DNA. It's part of who you are. The last thing is to be persistent. This is near the end of Paul's letter to the Galatians. He gives these instructions about serving others. Let us not grow weary while doing good, for in due season we will reap if we don't lose heart. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all, especially to those of the household of faith. Now here's the thing. I think it's easier to minister to people when the pain of loss is fresh. In the first days after a loss, people were showered with kindness and love and compassion. But then listen, after the funeral, everyone goes back to the normal routine of work and family and responsibilities, and we go on with life. We go back. Our life hasn't been dramatically changed. Their life will never be the same. We go back to life as it always was and as it continues to be, and they go home. And it's never going to be the same for them. And it's easy to grow weary of ministering to people who are in grief. Now, I don't know if this is true, but I think it's possible that the Lord's church has a lot of what I would call first responders. They arrive on the scene, but we need more members who will dedicate themselves to long-term care. Because the real suffering for a lot of people happens after they go home. And there's a place at the table that's going to be empty. Can you imagine? The two become one flesh. There's somebody that's been married for decades. And they go home and they're so used to that person being there that they turn to talk to them. They know they haven't. They know it's not a psychological thing, but they're just so accustomed to that person being there. And they're not there. I want to give you one example of what that might look like. I think it was about 2 years ago we decided to do something on a Sunday morning to honor our elders. I think it's the only thing in 18 years of working with that church that I ever planned without asking for their permission first, because that would have ruined the surprise. But we asked members of the congregation to write letters, and we collected all of the letters, and then we bound them in a book. We copied them, and they each of the elders got a book with all of these personal letters from the members of the church. It was a beautiful thing. Well, one of the members wrote about a year after they were Christians who identified. They weren't converted there, but when they became part of our family, about a year after identifying with our congregation, their son took his own life. And he talked about how one of the elders, his name is Kelly White, came and sat with them and cried with them and held their hands and listened to all their stories and prayed with them. That's a first responder. That's a first responder. He said a year later, on the anniversary of our son's death, it was a Sunday morning, one of the elders, Charles Williams, who's 94 years old now, quietly came to their pew, put his hand on this man's shoulder, and he said, I know what today is, and I just want you to know that I know what you're going through, and we love you, and we're praying for you. That's long-term care. You got to care enough. You've got to care enough to know that this is the anniversary of a tragic death, and to have the tact and the gentleness and the humility to be able to come up and express love and compassion in that situation. Sometimes people say, well, I just don't know what to do. I mean, I'd like to do more of this. I mean, if we're serious about this weeping with those who weep, let's just review it. We're going to be aware, we're going to be present, we're going to be quiet, we're going to be helpful, we're going to be persistent. And people go, but I don't know what to do. Well, just practice the golden rule. I think that's some of the best advice I can give you. If you would look at what other people are going through and think in terms of what would I want people to do for me? If that happened to me, what would comfort me? What would help me? What would give me strength? And if you can figure out what would mean the most to you, then just do that. Just do that. I think I have time for one more story. I got a card in the mail. It's from one of our elders' wives. My brother had passed away, and we got so many. I mean, I've never received that much mail in my life. I was amazed. I was really overwhelmed by the outpouring of love and just compassion and comfort. But you know, she wrote in that little card something so comforting and so wise. I don't remember the exact wording, but it was something to the effect of, we look forward to hearing you tell your stories about him. We want to know about him. Do you know one of the most, I'm just telling you, I look at that almost as a milestone to healing. Someone gave me permission to talk about him. You know what we all think? We all think the person who's grieving, if we talk about the person they lost, they're going to cry, and they will cry. But you know what? It's one of the most healing things. They love it. They love it. We stood, it was in Henderson, Tennessee. I want to say it was the Estes congregation. And for 2 hours, I stood there with my brother, my mother, my father, my sister-in-law, and my niece and nephew. And literally, the line, I think, had gone out of the building, through the foyer, along the back wall, and down. And these people would come by. And my brother was lifetime. I mean, he taught all his life. He was a math teacher. And this little girl came out and she said, all I ever wanted to do was be a teacher. And nobody believed that I could do it but Mr. Lewis. Mr. Lewis believed in me. And she said, I'm a teacher. Ah. You think we cried? Yeah, I cried. A couple little boys came up and they couldn't even speak. They were just weeping. And I don't know why my brother Mike knew it. He said, he taught your Bible class, didn't he? Yeah. One guy came up and you could tell something was wrong with his arm. Well, my brother was on a trip with the students and there was a terrible bus accident. And he was on that bus and this kid was permanently injured. And he said something about, I would have never gotten through that. And he meant emotionally, if it wasn't for Mr. Lewis. And even now, when I recall all of those memories and share them with you, it's so healing. It's so memorable to think that even as we drove through town on the electric sign outside of the Baptist church, it said, Mr. Lewis, thank you for all you've done. Well, those things are healing and helpful. And sometimes just hearing other people's memories, things we didn't even know, was one way that others were able to weep with us as we went through our own personal experience with grief. So I hope there's something in that lesson that you can take home and practice that will make your church family a more loving and a more welcoming, a more compassionate family of believers. I'm so grateful. This thing says I have 1 minute and 30 seconds left, and I'm not one to waste. I'm preaching to a congregation of people who practice what I just preached. I had a friend named Judy Davis, and Judy's friend, Michael O'Brien, got sick in Denver, and he died here. And this congregation, I don't know how well you knew him. I know you probably didn't know her at all until you met him. You walked with them through every step of that diagnosis and sickness and the grief of his passing in the most beautiful and wonderful way. And there's an interesting privilege of preaching to people when you know they practice what you preach. And it's beautiful, I think, testimony of your faith. So it's a privilege to be here, and I couldn't be happier with the lesson you assigned.